Welcome to the Sacramento Injury Law Podcast.
Welcome to the Sacramento Injury Law Podcast with Brian Jacobsen of Aiken and Jacobsen. I'm Lisa Mosbey, your host. With decades of experience fighting for the injured across Northern California, Brian is here to walk us through what evidence actually matters in a personal injury case and what can make or break the outcome. Welcome, Brian. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Lisa. Good to be here again.
Thanks. This isn't always a fun subject. Personal injury is tough. Somebody is probably going through some challenges, some tough time in their life. But what evidence ends up carrying the most weight in a personal injury case?
Usually there's about three kinds. You got to have a medical documentation, obviously. You need something to prove the liability of somebody did something wrong. And then you also want to have something that allows you to do damage calculations. Missing any component of those is going to certainly weaken your case.
What are some of the most important pieces of evidence that need to be secured early?
Well, the biggest one is going to be witness statements. Anything that somebody saw or felt or heard, you want to get on those quickly because people have a tendency to forget as time goes on. So the sooner you can get that documented, the better it will be for your case.
Sure, I can imagine that. I know, I can't remember what I ate for breakfast yesterday. Now you're in this highly heightened emotional state trying to remember what was going on. I can see how that would matter. And then what about the timeline? Timeline of collecting evidence. How does that affect the strength of a case?
Well, the quicker that you can get the information, the better it is, obviously. What we like to do is within the first 1 to 3 months following the accident, we're trying to get as much information and as much investigation done as possible. That may be things about, in most cases, it's going to be liability focused because at that point, the person's going through treatment and their damages, which are going to rely mainly on medical documentation, maybe talking to experts, that's going to come at its own pace. But you can certainly investigate the case itself within that first, like I say, 1 to 3 months. If it's a car accident, for instance, you'd go to the scene, get some photographs, maybe talk to an accident reconstructionist if necessary. If it's any type of other accident, you're going to want to go and speak with the witnesses like we talked about earlier. Because again, the memories fade and you want to get them when they're at their best. So that's obviously what I would try and do. And, you're going to focus on getting police reports, photos, video evidence, anything like that, eyewitness statements. Sometimes in those first couple of months, you may want to get employment records if it turns out that the person has lost some time from work or won't be able to go back to work. Those are the type of things that I'm going to focus on in those first several months following the accident.
And I want to dive into those a little bit deeper, Brian. I'm thinking medical records first. Beyond just showing that someone was injured, how do medical records play out in a case? How are they used as evidence?
Well, the medical records themselves are very important because they are going to document what the person had to go through, whether it was, a serious injury or even a not so serious injury. You still want to get the documentation so that you can be able to present that later on, whether it's through settlement negotiations or ultimately if it goes to trial. But those records are a lasting impression of what happened to the person that you're representing.
And that's used as evidence in how during a case?
Sorry. As evidence in the sense of it can be just presented to, if you're dealing in a settlement negotiation, it would be presented just in front of the other person that you're dealing with, sending copies to, in cases that you resolve before trial would be insurance adjusters, things like that. Simply reading them, the adjuster will be able to know exactly the extent of the injury. If it goes to trial, the way that those would be presented would be through a doctor, chiropractor, physical therapist, whoever has treated the person. They would actually come and testify on the stand as to what happened, and they can use their records, but it would be mainly on, what they've gone through. The records would be just a help for them at that point.
Sure, supporting what it is that they're saying. And I want to talk about expert witnesses. They help connect the dots and in a way that maybe the documents can't connect not just medical experts, but other experts. Would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, I would agree with you. The expert witnesses are very important when it goes to trial. It's part of your job as an attorney is to develop a story and tell a story that is got to keep your jury awake, and that's part of it. So one of the things that juries do, they just I can't seem to get them to like is just if you sit there and read medical record after medical record, it's a pretty boring thing. But if you can have somebody come in and testify, and we have witnesses that are particularly good, they can come in and actually educate a jury, and it livens up the the jury itself. So that's the way I would use an expert witness, is to sort of, uh, I guess, hit home with the jury and sort of identify and connect with a jury that the medical records, something just written on paper, is not going to ever do.
Yeah, hearing somebody tell you about something versus hearing it from the
Right.
source, I think it lands differently. I agree with you on that one. What challenges come up when key evidence is missing or was never documented at the scene?
That can be a tough one. A lot we do run into that quite a bit. People get in accidents and, hey, Brian, I didn't think it was necessary to file a police report, and then at that point everybody's fighting about what happened. The best you can do is try and work around that, in the sense of, hopefully there's some witnesses that saw what happened or heard what happened. Maybe there's, other documentation, other circumstantial evidence, but it's pretty tough. If the evidence is not there, or it's been lost, or just hasn't been gathered to begin with, it's difficult to work around that, other than, trying to get as much as you can in the way of witnesses, or, some other circumstantial type of evidence that would help your case.
It makes me think that, you're telling a story and you have these big gaps. How believable is it if we have those gaps? So, how do you fill in when you have those gaps? How do you as an attorney try to connect that for folks so that it's believable, it's understandable?
Yeah, I mean, that's our number one goal, is trying to fill in the gaps, because insurance companies are very good about, soon as they see a gap, they're going to look at that as, well, the person must be done treating. They must be A-OK. They've obviously cut it off. So our job is to try and explain, if there is a gap, and many times there are, we want to explain why. Maybe the person had a sick family member that they had to care for, that, obviously that's more important than going to a doctor for some physical therapy or something along those lines. Now, insurance companies don't like to hear that, but that's the reality of life. Things come up that may be more important than, trying to get better from a case. And we just want to point that out. We want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to explain to, whether it's insurance adjusters that we deal with initially, or ultimately a fact finder on a jury, why there are gaps in treatment. And as long as you can come up with a reasonable explanation, I don't think it's really a problem.
Okay. And I know insurance companies use inconsistencies. They use those gaps in the evidence to push back on a claim. So I can see there's a tremendous amount of value there. How do you address that when they're using those inconsistencies, I'll say?
It's just, you want to do as much as you can to document as much as you can. The reason why is, the more you document, the stronger your case is going to be. Insurance companies want to think the worst of everybody. So if there's, like you say, a gap in treatment, that's a red flag for them, that, oh, the person must be completely healed and done with treatment, and therefore anything after that is unrelated to our accident. What you want to do is obviously try and explain what that gap, the reason for that gap. If there's any other problems with the case, again, you just have to assume the insurance company, because they're trying to save money. I mean, I get that from their side. So what they're trying to do is point at anything and everything that is going to work in their favor. And a good attorney will be able to argue around that. And like I say, documentation's a big part of it, but it really just depends on the facts of the case. And as long as you can come up with a reasonable alternative, I don't think it turns into a problem.
Details, documentation. So, what does your process look like when you're building a case that you expect could go to trial?
It comes back to documentation again. Sorry, I keep using that word, but the reality is, if you're going to go to trial, you want to make sure everything is documented. The more you have in documentation and the better you can lay out the entirety of your case, the stronger your claim is going to be, and it's less wiggle room for the other side. So again, whether, I know we talked about trial, but whether it's dealing with the insurance adjuster up to trial or through trial, anytime you have more documentation on the case, the better it will be, so that they have nowhere to go. They'd have no explanation for, well, I'd like to argue this or I'd like to argue that. If you've documented your case from the beginning, 9 times out of 10, you leave them nowhere to go.
Let's talk about that process, Brian. I know we have medical records. We are at the scene you mentioned. What are some of the other things involved in that documentation? Like, can you give us a list of those? And I know it depends on the case, but just so people have an idea.
Let's take a normal car accident case. The first thing I would want to get is a copy of the police report. Sometimes the police actually take photographs. Sometimes they do video. You want to get all of that. I've had cases where they've had traffic cams and people are arguing about, well, I didn't go through the red light. Well, the video shows you did. So again, anything we can get that is close in time, whether it's an actual video of the scene itself when it happened, that's great. A lot of people now, again, I keep going back to car accidents, but a lot of people now have the dash cams in their cars. Those are very helpful, because if they have that information, that's great documentation. Tells exactly what happened in most car accident cases, if you have that. If not, we're going to try and, interview the police officers or whoever the responding officer was as quickly as possible before they deal with a lot of accidents every day. So we want to get them, as quickly as we can. Some of that involves sending an investigator out to meet with people, whether it's witnesses, to get statements, things like that. And then it kind of transitions, once you've got your liability figured out, then it's going to transition to more of the damage aspect or the damage phase of the case. And that's going to be documentation, meaning getting all the copies of your medical records, the medical bills. A lot of times it's prior medical records. If a person has had, for instance, prior back pain and they get in an accident and the back pain is increased, well, I can almost guarantee you the insurance company is going to say your back was as bad as it was and the accident didn't do anything to it. So we want to make sure that we get the documentation to show that, no, that person's back was fine. Yes, he had problems, but just like all of us, as we get older, the back was not an issue. He or she was back working. So, again, employment records might come into view. We might need to get those to show that the person was fully employed and working hard, had no prior issues of taking time off work, for instance. And all of a sudden, now the insurance company is left with less ways to point out that they shouldn't pay money for an accident that their person caused.
I'm wondering, how does a well-documented case change the way the other side approaches maybe settlement and litigation?
A well-documented case is going to make it a lot easier for the person to recover, and a lot harder for the insurance company or trial attorney to argue against you. There's just less ways to, again, anytime you're speculating about something, you have to go back to the insurance company is going to think the worst possible scenario, meaning if you stop treating, then you're 100% well, you're done. If you didn't get a police report, for instance, on the accident, and there's a dispute as to liability, they're going to believe what their person is saying, even if their person is lying. So as much as you can document and take those questions out of the case or issues out of the case, the stronger your case is going to be. And so what we try and do here is get as much of that as soon as possible, so that when we are trying to either resolve it or ultimately if we have to go to trial, the one thing we want to make sure is that we know exactly how it's going to play out, and there is no room for error. There's no room for, I didn't know this or I didn't know that. It's the old adage of you never ask a question you don't know the answer to. It's similar to that in the sense of you want to make sure sort of all your ducks are in a row and you have everything, again, documented so that you have a very strong case and don't leave any outs for the insurance company or other side, so to speak.
Excellent. Thank you so much for walking us through this process. It's things that we don't normally think about, and it's been very valuable. Thank you so much for your time today, Brian.
Sure. I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Lisa.
Folks, thank you for listening to the Sacramento Injury Law Podcast. If you have questions about your own case or need expert advice following an accident, visit Brian at aikenjacobsenlaw.com to schedule a consultation. Don't forget to leave a review, subscribe, and share this show with somebody who may need it today. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.